Hello, good morning, or afternoon, or evening. Today's workshop will be on case strategy and burdens of proof, and it's going to be generally applicable to PM and LO speeches in BP debate, but I think it should be pretty relevant to any kind of debate format that requires you to prove arguments and give cool speeches. This is the second workshop in my BP workshop series that is for you Chicago debaters trying to learn the fundamentals of BP debate. I think it should be generally helpful for both beginners and intermediate debaters. Feel free to watch it as a standalone or as part of a larger series. Cool. Okay, let's just jump right into it. And I should say that this workshop is a combination of various different people's ideas, some people from CDS, UChicago, and also workshops, primarily the Burdens of Proof lecture by Hadar, and also the PM speeches video by Noam Dahan. Cool. So, what does a PM and LO speech like actually look like? What is the time allocation? I think again, this obviously varies from person to person, but generally, if you watch many videos, you'll see that it kind of follows the same format. Firstly, you start with an intro, and this includes both a snazzy little hook and also you signposting the rest of your speech. So something like, in this speech, I will do three things. First, I will prove X. Second, I will prove Y. And third, I will do this, right? Then you'll go into your model and characterization of the motion, if the motion so requires. And then you'll give either 1 to 2 arguments and take a POI before 5 minutes are up, generally. I should say that I do not usually give first speeches in BP because my brain works rather slowly, and I think that the turnaround time is rather difficult because you do have to start speaking very quickly. So I will try my best to walk through what I think makes a good PM and LO speech, but you should take everything with a very, very fine grain of salt. So firstly, let's start with the introduction. You can kind of think of a BP speech in a similar way that you might think of an analytical essay in English, where it kind of looks like a funnel paragraph, right? So you're slowly building to the thesis of your argument and you're narrowing down your case more and more. And so the intro is the widest part of that funnel paragraph. And I think it is quite an underrated part of BP. So my mind about introductions and framing got changed a lot after I watched this video right here, which I highly recommend. And the essence of that is that language is a very powerful rhetorical tool. And in any kind of speech, the first and last thing you say is going to be the thing that sticks into people's mind the most. And I think the beautiful part about BP as an activity is that it's not formulaic, right? It's not evaluated by AI robots who go beep boop, let me weigh your arguments and then compute out a decision. It's evaluated by a panel of humans who are able to be convinced by rhetoric that they feel is especially powerful and convincing. Two people could be trying to make the same argument, but the way that you deliver the argument can make it more or less persuasive. And for that reason, I think that like people should really think carefully about how language and the way that you choose your words and the way that you deliver those words makes a big difference in how your case is received. And so, like, who are these two people? Um, on the left, you have Plato, and this guy basically just said, like, words and definitions have a fixed meaning. He was a bit of a realist, a hardline realist, and he's like, words just mean one thing or another thing. The guy on the bottom is Wittgenstein, and he advocated for basically the use theory of language, which is the idea that language is socially constructed. The same word like game could mean many different things to many different people, right? You could be playing games over text over with someone you like, or you could be, watching a football game. You could be gaming on your computer. And it's not necessarily that language is fundamentally indeterminate, but that the situation and the way that you use language is incredibly important. So, in each debate, you should ask yourself in your introduction, in 1 minute, how can I succinctly appeal to some kind of human logic, emotion, or rationality to make my case as convincing as possible, irrespective of whatever else comes next, right? Like that is what you should try to aim for when you're thinking about your path to victory and you're thinking about the metric that you can use to establish in order to win. So, despite me loving Plato, in this case, I'm gonna say he's wrong. So, I think introductions are a bit of a Trojan horse because On face, they seem rather silly and stupid. And I used to think like, oh, it's just this weird thing that people do because BP is kind of like a goofy activity and people just say wishy-washy things. I slowly learned that very often when I was winning rounds, I was hearing, judges' OAs and the reason for why they voted be very distinct mirror images of the introduction that I chose somewhat implicitly to give. An example for that is like one round when we were talking about immigration and illegal immigration. I was explaining why attempting to ban immigration might be something like trying to, patch up holes in a sponge or something, right? Right? Like you can try to patch up one hole, but in the end, it's kind of like a leaky bucket. Another hole might just emerge. I think other really effective ideas, like sort of examples I can come up with, was in the roundabout trauma plots in Worlds. I came up with a kind of stupid example about how watching BoJack Horseman, don't know why I chose an animated horse, but like how I really resonated with that character and how even if it was a trauma plot, it made me actually understand, the issues that I was going through the vehicle of a fictional character, which would be a lot easier to understand for me than, for instance, watching or reading something that was quite methodical or psychological or scientific in nature. Those kinds of examples, I think, aren't necessarily round winning or losing, but they do set the stage for the kinds of arguments you want to make and the kind of debate you want to have. And so I think they can take sort of three different buckets in the standard buckets of like, how do you convince someone of a point? First, you can think about using ethos, right? Establishing yourself as a credible source for the kinds of arguments you want to make, particularly if it's a policy or a current events motion, and you have some kind of spec knowledge about the country or the policy that you're talking about, whether that's economic policy or something like the ICC or the World Bank or the Federal Reserve. So you can do this by talking quickly about a current event that you've observed in the headline and why that supports your case, or you can give a personal anecdote, like for instance, there was a round where it was about Canadian housing policy, and I had happened to work for a Canadian housing AI tech startup, and I talked about an experience that I had doing that sort of internship work. Or this is my personal favorite. You can appeal to emotion, right? And you can do this depending on the round through several different things. You can have a joke, right? The joke can be flaming another team in the round, or it could just be kind of, memeing on a certain topic. Like for instance, there was a round about, childhood geniuses, and me and my partner, we had went to the Mozart Museum in Austria, and we talked about how like the other team had cited Mozart as this great and wonderful example, but in reality, Mozart lived a quite terrible life. He was forced to travel thousands of miles by his father, became an alcoholic, and functionally like hated his existence, even if he created like wonderful music for the world to enjoy. And so we're like, haha, you think Mozart is so great. In reality, Mozart was the like OG emo boy, right? You can also use like a metaphor or an analogy or an imagery. um, I explained a metaphor before, but I think metaphors are super fun. Obviously, you run into the risk of flattening whatever thing that you want to discuss or coming up with an analogy that is not exactly perfect. But I do think analogies work in many, many instances, right? Like you can talk about how, if one team is proposing something super, disproportionate, they could be like, you are trying to use a sledgehammer instead of, I don't know, a pickaxe to solve an issue. Kind of a bad analogy, but like you see my point, right? Or you can use a quote. I'm not particularly good at this because I have a really bad memory, but there are certain people, I would say, from usually countries where they have like a cool, fancy accent and, they sound very suave, where they'll like literally recite poetry or other famous speeches. You might remember a few speeches like this that helps establish, the kind of rhetorical power they want when it comes to like starting a political revolution or talking about social movements or why you should take a strong stance. Finally, you can appeal to logic. And like, let's say you're the kind of person you're like, this sounds terrible. I don't want to tell stories. I don't want to like, sound all emotional. Then you can do things like cite examples or statistics that you know if you have a matter file or if you just know things off the top of your head, like X amount of the world lives under, the poverty line, or this many people have perished in a global disaster. Those kinds of things are also incredibly effective. But I think the most important thing is not, which one of these three things you choose, but to choose the right kind of introduction that establishes the argument that you want to make. So if the argument you want to make is that For instance, you know, all human lives are important, irrespective of whatever, pragmatic outcome might like emerge from that, then you probably want to have a quote or an analogy that really illustrates that point. Or if your argument is that like it doesn't really matter if like five people get triggered passively by some kind of media, if one person gets deeply and profoundly affected, then maybe what you want to do is have a personal anecdote or imagery that really carefully illustrates that point so that it becomes sort of the weighing metric into your argument, right? So again, 1 minute to win is sort of the philosophy you should have when you're choosing an introduction. And I think this is really important because your framing and your introduction, and I'll get into framing in a moment, is the substructure that should contextualize the rest of your debate. And so, like, if you think of architecturally, the substructure is the foundation that the debate stands on, and the superstructure is going to be all of the arguments that you build on top of that. And if your substructure is shaky, or the judge doesn't really understand it, or you're not positioning your arguments in the best way possible, then the superstructure is just going to fall down no matter how well you try to construct it. And so I think the most important thing is just getting people to care, because the reality is in a round that is like over an hour, 30 minutes long, people get quite apathetic, right? Like there's an incentive to tune out and not listen very carefully. And the extent to which you can make your arguments stick, especially if you're on opening half, when tons of people will be trying to discredit them later on. If you set the parameters and the stakes of the debate, it then becomes incredibly difficult for a closing team to try to shift it into something entirely different. If you're like, this debate is going to be about economic empowerment, or this debate is just going to be about some kind of principled obligation, and you explain why, then someone could try to say all they want, but they're not going to change the substructure if you are the first person to set that down at the start of the round. So, again, I am a big proponent of having like phrases that discipline yourself. And I like this kind of a secret. I used to have a sticky note that I would like, if I was online, place on my computer, or if I was in person, like put on my folder. And I would literally write down the quotes that I wanted to say. Because again, I have no self-control. So it was very hard for me to like allocate my time correctly. And so I would say something like, if I can prove X, you should be persuaded that we outright win the debate, right? And you should write your introduction on a separate piece of paper or on the top of the paper of the speech that you're going to give, separate from all of your other arguments. So you remember to say it and you know precisely what you're going to say. Like I have a little inner voice inside of my head, like a little monologue, and I will rehearse it at least like one time for like 15 to 20 seconds. So I feel prepared for my introduction. So, another tip that I would say that will help you to do this is by establishing linguistic dominance. What I mean by this is like the sort of theories of language that I was just talking about. The way that you describe something is very important in how people think about that thing and interpret that thing. And I think a lot of this definition setting or this term setting happens in the first few minutes of the debate. So for every word or policy, like most of the time, it is not going to be purely descriptive, right? There's going to be some prescriptive implication attached to it. Maybe sometimes it's pejorative, right? It has a negative connotation, and sometimes maybe it has a positive connotation. Depending on which side of the debate you're on, you're going to want to try to shift the motion towards either the positive or the negative side with the vocabulary that you choose to use. Examples, if we're talking about trauma plots, if you're on Gov and you're supporting trauma plots, like for instance, A Little Life, or like BoJack Horseman, or I don't know, like some of the Sally Rooney books, right? Then you're going to want to use words like survivorship, the authentic experience, right? You're decreasing stigmatization and increasing awareness. You're popularizing the narratives in order to reform them. You're legitimizing victims. On the other side, you're obviously going to want to do things like, no, this glorifies and glamorizes and trivializes and dilutes very real narrative because it makes it something that is a commodification of true and real victimhood. So obviously, you're talking about the exact same thing in two very different ways, and having an introduction that establishes those terms is very helpful. Similarly, if you're debating a stigma against laziness and whether that's good or bad, on one hand, you might say, what we're talking about isn't really a stigma against laziness. We're talking about being anti-grind culture, right? You're talking about normalizing the fact that people might just need to take a break and normalizing the fact that laziness is not always something that is inherently bad because there's a lot of reasons why someone might be lazy. On the other hand, if you're like, no, this is a good thing, you can be like, we live in a world of free riders where people have an incentive to be neglectful and careless and wasteful, right? And they have an incentive to ride off of other people's achievements and, um, laziness would just allow and enable them to do these things even further. Similarly, there might be like actual words attached to um, like a term in the motion. So if cult of productivity is being used, that's obviously pejorative. So you might change that to proactive lifestyle. Military intervention sounds quite bad, so you might change it to, humanitarian relief or stepping in to stop an authoritarian regime. You might avoid using those words. So that's kind of what I mean by linguistic dominance, because debate isn't just a sort of a technical game, it's also a linguistic and qualitative game. I think a really good example is the opening speech in the World's 2016 finals, which I often talk about. And I'll just play like the first bit of it.
Madam Chair, the global poor all around the world, and no matter what country in which they live, currently live in a system of dictatorship. They live under a dictatorship known as no alternatives, shackled by capital that's been unjustly acquired, constrained by landed gentry who have no incentives but to pursue their own interests, and chained by the fact that they can't do anything but to look at the question of their own subsistence. They're unable to reach out for the right to liberty and to self-determination that we think inheres in the human condition. How are we going to define?
So that is a great example about a hook that, granted, takes almost like 30 seconds to a minute of the speech, but sets the parameters using language about what the stakes of the debate are. Because it's not just that the poor is justified in pursuing complete Marxist revolution, right? Which sounds quite radical, but it's the fact that there is no other alternatives. People are shackled to the condition that they live in, and they often have no other recourse besides violence. So that's the sort of introduction. Next, we'll transition into what is good framing and what does it look like to sort of set what the world of the debate looks like. And he'll do this right here.
A Marxist revolution in this debate. We say that in all its forms, it shares the feature of wanting to break down the system of private property. That's what a Marxist revolution means. It can take place in one of two ways. One is it can happen through internal systems that exist presently. That is to say that you vote in Marxist governments who support things like mass redistribution and the abolishment of private property, or it can exist externally in the instance of forcibly bringing down governments that for far too long have tread on these people's rights. The first thing that I'm going to note, just on account of the model, is just a picture of what we think this world looks like. That is to say, we accept that this attempt at revolution won't succeed in all instances, that in many instances it'll just lead to the rise of Marxist parties. But in the world in which we do succeed, we encourage you to use your imagination. That is to say, just notice how chronocentric our vision of civilization is. That is,
So, another really effective thing that you can see through this framing and the modeling is that suddenly and quite implicitly, the parameters of the debate have shifted. When you hear the word complete Marxist revolution, oftentimes this elicits a very violent notion of completely, you know, killing and violently overthrowing the proletariat and destroying the world as we know it, right? To make sure that working class people completely own the means of their subsistence. That's quite hard to achieve, and the op line is just going to be like, this is completely ridiculous. But I think Bo like sort of gives himself a little bit more ground to work on in a few ways. Number one, he explains that a Marxist revolution is abolishing the system of private property. Yeah, that's a, oh my God, I don't know why there's a thumbs up. Yeah, that's a pretty large aim, but it's also relatively more imaginable than some of the more crazy strands of Marxism, right? And it's something that you can strive for slowly rather than it being like sort of a binary all or nothing. So you can socialize ownership of some companies, right? You can slowly erode private property rights. And it's very, very tangible metric, which we talked about last time, to work towards. Secondly, he gives himself two avenues for what a revolution is. The first one is actually not very radical. It is voting in Marxist parties into government. And the second one is sort of complete revolution. But this is actually incredibly effective because if you think about it, if this motion is just like voting in socialist governments and politicians, then obviously the poor is justified in pursuing that, right? Like maybe in this worldview, that also counts as complete Marxist revolution, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And it's kind of a strategic way to make your own burden that you have to defend a lot smaller because it gives you the flexibility of pursuing two different avenues based on what is more realistic and what is helpful in the circumstances that you're in. So I think that's just an example of like secretly effective framing that just seems like powerful rhetoric, but actually changes the technical elements of the debate itself. Oh, okay. So how does he do that? What is modeling and what is characterization? This should be sort of the next like minute of your speech. And in total, I think the intro and the model should be about a minute and 30 seconds. So, there are different motion types. You guys should definitely read the World's Manual or like a motion wording guide if you are confused. Because, like, Lord knows, I actually never know when you're supposed to model an emotion or not. I kind of have to ask. So, yeah, don't be me. There's two types of motions. There's policy motions that start with either this house would do this, or this house believes that person blank should pass this policy, right? And in these instances, OG should model exactly what this looks like. They have the fiat to be able to explain what this looks like, how this is actually implemented. And both OG and O should characterize sort of what the actors are and what their incentives are. OO also has the ability to counter model, meaning that they can propose their own model using the same amount of fiat power, so the same amount of sort of implementation that it would require to do OG's model. And it must be mutually exclusive. So it cannot just be OG's model plus a cookie or OG's model minus a stick. In analysis motions, it's any kind of motion that starts with literally anything else. And both OG and O should characterize the likely way that the motion would play out. So they can't say, I think the government will do a slow implementation and it will only target like low income communities, right? Like they don't just get a fiat that. They might just say the government obviously has an incentive to do it in that way because the government, is scared of political backlash and it is accountable to its electorate. I think that in general, like policy and analysis motions kind of converge to a similar conception of the world because in both instances, you're talking about the best way to implement something. But I think in policy motions, you can be a little bit more specific and you have to do a little bit less arguing for why that is actually the policy that would be passed. So, how do you choose what? So, yeah, okay, here's a brief quiz. What motion type is what? You can pause. Should be pretty easy. It's like a binary answer. Um, I would say the only thing is that you should be careful that it's only when this house believes that X should Y that you should model, and not just like this house believes that seatbelts are good. Like you wouldn't model in that instance. So, for instance, two is not a model, and four is because it's this house believes that artists should ignore the opinions of others while making art. Great. Yeah, I already kind of explained this, but models cannot be squirrels, right? You can't just avoid the motion and you can't fiat perfect implementation, but otherwise you have sufficient leeway to sort of model what you think the world is going to look like. Whereas characterization is defining the important terms, clarifying exactly who defends what, right? So we're defending this and they're explicitly defending why, particularly in motions where it's very confusing what the gray area is. Like we are prioritizing growth over inequality, or we are prioritizing um, the most vulnerable population rather than everyone, right? Like those are wishy-washy, so you should characterize who is defending what, and you'll do likelihood analysis to set up a favorable world. So, what does the political system currently look like? What do the actors, what are their incentives, and why are they aligned with your side of the house? All of those kinds of things count as characterization. So, as an example, for the motion, this house would ban cigarettes. the model should be relatively favorable for the gov side, right? So you're not going to want to just say, tomorrow we wake up and suddenly all the cigarettes in the stores are illegal, and if you sell them, you go to prison for 50 years. That's kind of stupid. So the way that you might model this strategically is being like, firstly, this ban probably applies everywhere across the world because otherwise it's very easy to make arguments about how black markets might seep in from like Canada to the US or from US to Mexico. The timeline, you might phase in the span over 5 years, right? Because for any kind of policy motion, it's generally in your incentive to explain why there's a slow phase in and it's not going to be immediate, because otherwise you get all sorts of transitory shocks and, um, harmful side effects, short-term side effects about how like people react to this with a lot of backlash. Thirdly, your punishment, you might say there's a harsh jail time for any violators found selling cigarettes because you don't want to have like a very soft stance, right? Because then your policy doesn't really do anything. And maybe you want to just clarify that this applies to both regular and e-cigarettes, just so there's no weird arguments about how like everyone starts being a vape god now. Right. So that's kind of an example of how you might strategically model to be in your favor. And you sort of want to think about the different elements so you can do this in a reasonable way, but also a very specific way that prevents the op from making generic arguments about how, well, this is implemented in the most horrible way possible, and that's what makes it very bad. So, modeling practice, you guys can pause and think about this a little bit. Um, this house believes that in areas of socioeconomic deprivation, schools should train students in vocational skills to the exclusion of the liberal arts. So, what are important things to consider for the model that might make it more reasonable for you, or the characterization, right? So, like, firstly, you probably want to explain that this is schools where like not primary schools, like probably secondary or tertiary schools. So in elementary school, you're still going to learn the basic subjects, right? You might want to explain what does it mean to have socioeconomic deprivation, right? It might be places where it's like quite literally like people are just not going to higher education institutions where there's large amounts of unemployment, and maybe in many instances local like industries have been decked and there's crises where people are not able to correctly find vocation. What does it mean to exclude liberal arts? It might mean, making it so that there's no mandatory core subject requirement. So not everybody has to learn English and math, but there's still a level of choice in what kind of vocational skills you want to learn, and that these vocational skills will typically be well representative of the trade that exists in that specific region. Right? So like kind of the obvious stuff. Second, this house believes that India should prioritize policies that aim to significantly reduce economic inequality rather than rapidly drive economic growth. So obviously, you want to make sure that these things are mutually exclusive. So you might explain, what does it mean to reduce economic inequality? It might be targeted subsidies to vulnerable people, education that focuses specifically on women or people who exist in rural areas, right? Or for instance, like redistribution or subsidies to industries that are dying out, those kinds of things. Finally, this house would militarily intervene in Venezuela. Like you don't want this to be like, wow, we start bombing and nuking the entire country. It could be something like, who is doing the intervention? Is it the UN? Is it the like sort of a neutral third party? Is it a group of countries? Sort of up to you. Second, what does the intervention look like? What are the goals? Is it providing humanitarian assistance? Is it trying to set up systems of law? Is it trying to crack down on violence? Like you kind of have to set what you think this intervention is and why, that's a good and reasonable approach. Finally, and I think I touched on this a little briefly before, this house opposes the prominence of the trauma plot in media and art. You want to characterize what you're talking about and why the trauma plots you're talking about are likely to be good, right? And that goes with the sort of linguistic wordplay that I was talking about earlier. So yes, both good and bad trauma plots exist. Obviously, some are glamorizing and some are informative. But why are good trauma plots more likely? Firstly, because creators likely draw on their own authentic experiences. Like the writer doesn't want to create a very watered down, glamorized version of trauma plots. Second, the more trauma plots you have, the more likely the good kinds of plots are the ones that are going to be elevated. Comparatively, if you have less, that actually allows for only the most flashy ones to gain the most eyes, and there's no discourse around what makes something good or bad. And thirdly, you can just make the argument that, like, yes, some people might say that, like, the most shocking narratives win out. But how many times can you see something that's shocking and sort of morbid before you get very tired of it? In reality, most of the Oscar winners, most of the box office hits tend to be more nuanced stories because they are just more interesting and more novel and more unique. That kind of characterization, even if you can't model, is the kind of characterization that is very helpful in dictating what kinds of things you are defending. Here's some more practice that you can go through to characterize sort of what the actor or what the debate that you're defending looks like. Okay, great. Now we're going to go into sort of the final part of the lecture, which is we've talked about the introduction, we've talked about modeling and characterization. How do you construct the actual argument part of your speech? So, regardless of whether you have one or two arguments, I think approaching an argument takes a relatively similar form. You can think of an argument as a sort of a cake, a layer cake, and you want to make sure that you make arguments robustly. And so, what I mean by this is you want to avoid the gut instinct of assuming that everything that's going on in your head gets automatically telepathically transported to the judge. You want to make sure that you look at your own arguments with a degree of skepticism, and also that you remember that an argument is not just a sentence, right? It is a story. It is something that requires necessary and sufficient conditions. And it is something that includes a lot of different components in order for it to be convinced. Like, if the average person is a blank slate, then they're not going to just be convinced when you say a single sentence, right? You're going to have to give them reasons for why you believe what you believe, why all of the assumptions that you make are necessarily true, why this is more important than all the other considerations that they have. And a normal person naturally has questions when you give them a proposition. And so answering those questions and making sure that there's sort of no pages left unturned, and is that the expression? No stone left unturned, is what it means to make a good comprehensive argument. So what is the structure of this kind of argument? In APTA or in many traditional, more technical, I don't like that term, but like technical forms of debate, like PF or high school debate or policy, an argument you are taught has a claim, a warrant, and impacts. That's a very reductive, in my opinion, view of an argument because it's like most of the time, an argument isn't just going to be, I say this, there's 10 reasons to prove this, and then there's an impact of it, right? Because it's like most of the time, if I'm trying to argue why I think that having tax cuts on, or like, let's say I'm arguing, I don't think it's good to stop taxing tips, right? Like tips that you get in a restaurant. I could just be like, well, this is kind of bad because if you stop taxing tips, then maybe restaurants have an incentive to like pay people less. And they also, it means that like, people might start not tipping workers as much because they think that tips aren't going to be taxed as much. And this just means that like workers earn less, and that's really bad. But like that doesn't answer so many questions because it's like, what does this policy look like? How does this trade off with other policies? How does this impact tax revenue in one direction or another? What is the incentive of the workers? What is the incentives of the owners of the companies? What are the incentives of the people who are tipping? How much do they know about this policy? How much does this policy change their decision calculus? All of those things are like what people would naturally ask when in a conversation about these kinds of topics. And so they're questions that you should also be implicitly addressing when you are making arguments. And so in BP, traditionally, I think an argument has a lot more kind of forms, right? You have claims, you have mechanisms, which are like multiple layers to prove a claim. You have illustration of the argument, you have preemption of what the other side might say, and then you have sort of an endpoint of that argument. And what I want to focus a lot about is this idea of having an endpoint, right? And I think this is something that I don't implicitly think is very intuitive for most people. What I mean is, when you are making an argument, it is very easy to over-index on the tagline of your argument. This creates stagnation. This causes people to be very sad. This creates harm. This saves lives. This reduces disease. But that is just an assertion. That is not an endpoint of an argument. What an endpoint is what you distinctly and concretely are trying to prove with the specific mechanisms that you have, and it should be proportional to those mechanisms. So in a BP argument, what I might try to say is like, the claim that I am making is that when you do not tax tips, this means that there are economic distortions that often leave the worker worse off. And it means that the overall tax revenue that the government is actually able to collect is actually decreased in many instances. So that's the endpoint that I'm trying to prove. I will then use mechanisms and illustrations and preemptions to aim towards that specific endpoint and not just a vague impact of workers suffer or tax collection goes up or down. It's even better if you can explain the concrete margin that you're talking about, right? Like how much is revenue going to go down or how much are workers going to earn more or less? Obviously, like I think this is very hard to do in a really precise way, but I like to do something like what I call debate math. It's kind of like girl math, but it's like debate math, where you're like, for every $2 that you allow someone to save in tips, it actually creates like a three times impact on what their wages might increase or on how their wages might increase or decrease. Or for instance, for every, dollar you give to the hands of the workers, the proportional loss in tax revenue actually leaves them worse off, especially if the amount that they actually get to keep at the end of the day is often hazy, if not actively detrimental. Those kinds of like debate math where you can quantify the types of things you say with sort of examples are super helpful in defining the impact and the endpoint of your argument. So, how do you like think about how to do these kinds of things, right? Like, what are the kinds of questions that you're trying to answer? What do you need to prove to make sure an argument is comprehensive? This is where burdens of proof come in. And this is also a new topic that I did not understand in BP whatsoever when I was first starting out. Everyone's like, burdens this, burdens that. I'm like, bro, like, I have no idea, like, burden your mom or something. Like, I literally did not know what burdens meant. Um, but what was super helpful is thinking about burdens just as necessary and sufficient conditions to fill, and the natural questions that someone might have when you are making a claim. And so it is helpful to then structure your speech in terms of these questions and almost use questions instead of normal signposting as a logical flow of your speech. For instance, I think a good example of this is like, let's say you're trying to prove with that trauma plots example that trauma plots help people become more aware and feel catharsis about the trauma that they experience in their personal life. So you might say something like this. What is the endpoint of my argument? The endpoint of my argument is to prove that trauma plots help the most vulnerable kind of people realize and actualize their emotions in ways that would not be possible through traditional media. Why is trauma plot, why is the popularization of trauma plot more likely to lead to rise of good kinds of media rather than bad kinds of media? Then you can give your mechanism. Why is this actively good for the most vulnerable people? You can give your mechanism. And why is this important even if there is some level of glamorization or trivialization or re-traumatization from these kinds of media? Then you can give your arguments. Like that is kind of what I mean by proving your burdens. And I will say that Hadar's lecture is like what changed my mind on a lot of these things and really opened my mind to sort of taking a burden-based approach to argumentation. And so, like, I guess what I mean by this is like, they're like in a mathematical proof, right? You don't just get from A to B. You have to have a threshold of analysis and logical steps that bring you from point A to actually point B. And a lot of the times, like whether it's, you're trying to disprove something, like, proof by contradiction, or you're just trying to rigorously prove an argument is true, like you cannot just like miss one piece or, kick out one of those pieces and assume that your argument still stands. So you must justify all of your conclusions, particularly the ones that are very non-intuitive. And the non-intuitive ones are the ones that are just most likely to be contested by a random person. And this is important, especially if you're opening, because like a lot of the times when you're like vertically extending on someone as closing, all it takes is just filling one burden that a team might have missed, whether it's not having a counterfactual or not being comparative or not having characterization. And so you must fill in those places that are most likely to be contested. Otherwise, your argument just has so many logical holes that it's easy for someone on your bench or on the other bench to quickly take it down. So burdens are what it takes to get from a premise to an impact. For instance, saying that more people are born equals more carbon emissions, right? So this is a common argument someone might make about why it's bad to have more people being born if you want to solve global warming is not a sufficient proof because it could be the case that the more people there are, the more innovation there is, and the more innovation there is, the more carbon capture there is. So burdens are what it takes to get from that premise to the final impact. And I think that there are two types of stories um, that you can think about, right? And I think that in traditional technical debate, you tend to have like very like blippy debates where it's like very stepwise. So it's like A to B to C to D to E to F to G. That's what they call a link chain, or maybe, like warrants, right? So in traditional debate. The issue with that kind of debate is, as you can see, if you think about it as a domino chain, if you take out one domino, the rest of the dominoes here are just not going to fall. And so oftentimes when you're speaking second, you just want to think to yourself, what domino do I take out? So that even if they have this part of the chain and the second part of the chain, it doesn't really matter because like the core part of their argument doesn't function anymore. So you want to kind of avoid like stepwise stories. Instead, you want to have layered stories. I kind of like to think of it as a hamburger, right? So you have a burger bun, you have onions, you have pickles, you have a meat, you have lettuce, you have cheese. And that is very helpful because this is maybe like sort of like problem of vagueness thing, but it's like how burger is a burger. Because low-key, if you take out the cheese, it's still a burger. If you take out the onions, it's still a burger. If you take out the lettuce, it's still a burger. Debatably, you could take out the patty and it might still be a burger, right? And so like that kind of argumentation is helpful. Layered argumentation is helpful because it means that even if you are missing one of the layers, your argument might be weaker. Your burger might be less delicious, but it is nonetheless still a burger that is functioning and standing. And that's kind of the point of burdened and careful mechanization, which is that you sort of hedge your ability to make a careful argument. Because even if one part of your argument, one layer is questioned, if your core premises are proven and proven through multiple strong mechanisms, then your overall case, your overall argument can still stand. And I think like during prep as a second speaker, what I like to do is just like be the bad cop. And so what I mean by that is like if it is true that burdens are the places where your argument is non-intuitive and most likely to be contested, then as a second speaker, if you're not the one directly writing the case, you should be the bad cop that is like literally just pointing out where you feel it should be contested and where the holes should be so that the first speaker can plug those holes. And so, what Hadar talks about in her lecture is the idea of cookie cutter arguments, which is that most arguments take a similar form, a cookie cutter, and once you get used to that form, you can sort of overlay general arguments you make about a lot of different topics to specific forms of that argument, which is very helpful because it means that even if you don't know a lot about a certain thing, you can recognize patterns that make effective argumentation across that general category of topic area. So, for instance, bans create black markets, right? This is a very common argument you have with any kind of policy that aims to ban or significantly restrict something. This could range from this house would ban prostitution or alcohol or cigarettes to even something that you might not think necessarily applies to something like this house believes that the US should pay Panama significant per capita subsidies for detaining and repatriating migrants within the Darien Gap. So essentially, it's like you want to ban illegal immigration in the Darien Gap with Panama. And generally, the way that the debate plays out is you say ban is good because the activity it is banning is bad and has negative consequences. And the other side either says, no, the activity is not always bad. People should have choice and agency. And also, when you ban it, black markets that exist because there is no free market are often a lot worse. The black market could be underground prostitution, it could be black market drugs or cigarettes, or it could be newer immigration routes through more dangerous areas that honestly just threaten the life of the migrants even more. What are the burdens of proof here? It's the same set of questions that you would ask through any kind of debate. What is the comparative, right? So, what happens in the absence of a ban? What is the tipping point? Does the ban actually solve the problem that it is trying to address? Um, is there solvency? Sort of a similar thing, right? But is like the ban sufficient? Is there uniqueness? Are there other ways to accomplish the same goal? And is the benefit exclusive to one side only, or can something like regulation achieve the same thing? So, again, these are the kinds of questions that you would want to ask. Let's say we're arguing that a ban is good. What are the current harms? You want to start every debate with setting the stakes of the debate, right? So, why is the thing that you're trying to ban necessarily harmful, and why is a ban needed? Second, what does this ban look like? Third, why is the ban more effective at preventing the harms versus the likely counterfactual or comparative? For instance, it's not like if you don't ban cigarettes, it's going to be an entirely free market, right? It's not like if you don't try to, pay Panama subsidies for detaining migrants in the Darien Gap, it's just going to be free for all immigration. So what is actually likely to happen, and why is your policy better? And finally, admit that there are negative consequences, for instance, black markets, to the ban, but explain why it is worth the potential trade-offs because of the upside that it causes. So that's how I would structure the case. I would begin by saying the endpoint you're trying to prove, and then I would walk through these natural questions or the burdens that you want to prove and fill them in with reasonable mechanisms that prove the question or answer the question that you're asking. What are mechanisms, and how do you choose a good mechanism? A mechanism, which it sounds like a dumb, very jargony word, but it's just a specific reason. It's just a convincing reason to believe that you have a good answer to one of these questions, right? So for instance, what are the current harms? It could just be like people overindulging in drugs. The fact that there are negative health externalities that people don't internalize, either to the people around them or maybe to their future self. It looks like, you know, lobbying from corporations that prevent effective regulations. All of those things are mechanisms. And the mechanisms, in my opinion, should be quite strong because they do not co-opt the other side, right? Like you're not trying to just choose, symmetric things that happen on both sides. They should be very unique and come naturally as a result of the motion. So it is something that is directly implied from the policy or the narrative or the stance that you're going to take. You also should be quite judicious with the types of mechanism you choose. You shouldn't just list a laundry list of 5 or 10 different things. In general, I think 3 strong mechanisms for each core premise or burden is more than enough. And you want to prioritize the reasons that you think are the most convincing. And if you need help, I think that's where you should ask your partner to step in and say, hey, I need a mechanism for this specific burden that we've come up with. Can you help me? So, what you want to ask yourself is, are the mechanisms proportional to your impacts? Are they plausible and convincing? And are they comparative? And I think if you implicitly run through these questions in your mind every time you're proposing a mechanism or coming up with mechanisms, it'll help you differentiate between things that are very good and persuasive and things that are relatively less persuasive and that you might want to deprioritize. So, how I think this plays out in prep is after you've come up with the arguments you want to run. Firstly, you ask your partner, what is the endpoint of this argument? Next, you say, what are the burdens that we need to prove this argument? And you might leave some gap in between each burden. And then you say, what are 2 to 3 mechanisms that I can use to fill in each of these burdens? Quite intuitive, quite logical, quite, sort of like mechanistic, I guess. That's kind of a bad word, quite organized. But in general, I think that's a very clean and simple way to construct an effective case. Here are some example mechanisms. If the burden you are trying to prove is why is the ban more effective at preventing harms versus the comparative of regulation? A few different things you can come up with. One, bans are easier to enforce. It is easy to evade regulation because you can sort of skirt around it and you can find loopholes. 2, it eliminates legal gray areas or regulatory capture. Very oftentimes, when you have loose regulation or you don't really ban the sale of something, it's easy to backslide, especially if there's things like lobbying or politicians have an incentive to appeal to certain kinds of electorate. Whereas a ban is a wholesale ban and there's just a clear bright line. It is yes or it is no. Three, maybe you just need a ban because the kind of thing you're talking about has high externalities. So, like, we just believe that even if there's regulation, there's still marginal harms from consuming a regulated version of that thing, whether it's drugs or alcohol or um, an illegal activity, right? And so any kind of marginal harm is unacceptable, therefore we should ban it. Fourthly, bans change social perception. So instead of people having to figure out, is this legal or is this illegal, right? Can I get a medical card to consume marijuana? Can I sort of get a medical prescription for opioids? They don't have that decision fatigue and they just know to stay away. Maybe finally, bans are just simpler and cheaper for the government because it's better to enforce, which then creates innovation because companies, instead of trying to work around it, innovate ways. For instance, if you ban carbon emissions over a certain amount, then they have the ability to develop greenhouse gas capture, things like that. So all of these mechanisms to me seem fairly plausible, and you can choose what you think is the strongest as ways to illustrate that burden. Um, Here's some more examples. I won't go through them in depth, but you can ask yourself, for practice. Social narratives. This house believes the feminist movement should actively advocate for antinatalism. Here are what I think the burdens or the questions would be and how to structure your speech. And to be honest, the order you put them in doesn't really matter that much. What more so matters is that you answer all the questions. So, what does the message look like? In my opinion, I think the worst thing you can do, right? So antinatalism is the fact that you shouldn't have children, is to be like, yeah, the message is just like children suck and just don't have kids. The message probably looks something like a few different things. One, we should not have children in this specific world because the burden of childcare disproportionately falls on women, which means that it is inherently sexist to keep perpetuating the system. So the feminist movement uses this rationale for why they advocate for a version of antinatalism that exists in the 21st century. Number two, they might make arguments about why the world is just inherently a bad place for children because of sexism and discrimination and prejudice, particularly for female children. So you wouldn't want to bring a child into a world that looks like this. I think the important thing is characterizing why it's a kind of narrative that focuses on a problem related to feminism that can be solved if people pour in resources, but isn't solved right now, which is why there's an antinatalist approach, right? And that kind of goes into the next questions. What's the likely interpretation of this message by men, by other feminists, by non-feminist women, by marginalized communities, by people you might be trying to work with? What action is motivated by this, right? Can people actually do something concrete if you're advocating in this way? What is the counterfactual in the absence of this? What else would feminists talk about? Why is this uniquely a rally around the flag? Maybe it's because a lot of social movements can relate to antinatalism because many of them also have an inherently pessimistic view of what the world looks like, whether it's environmentalists or people who are advocating for specific minority groups, right? And what is the result of the counterfactual and why is that less desirable? All of these are the kinds of questions you want to be asking when you're debating social narrative motions. Next, economic growth. Similarly, all policies that talk about economic growth, if you're preferring economic growth, for instance, have inherent questions. Why is the growth lacking in the status quo? Notice how you typically ask the question of why the problem exists. What are the proposed policies? So, for instance, these policies could be lower taxes, specialized economic zones, removing anti-competitive subsidies, developing certain industries. Why do the proposed policies address growth that is lacking in a mutually exclusive way to other kinds of policies in the counterfactual? And why is this growth more important than whatever thing you're weighing against? That's how I would structure a very comprehensive speech that fulfills, I think, most of the burdens. Um, there are like many more examples for how you might illustrate these kinds of things. And I think a good practice is just taking emotion, listing out the burdens, and taking each of those burdens or claims and trying to have a very succinct way to be able to illustrate that thing. And to note that under every motion, there are multiple claims that you're trying to prove, not just one specific one. So, for instance, this one is talking about if you ban political families from running for office, it would encourage more political newcomers. There's many mechanisms you can use to illustrate this, but I encourage you to think about which specific ones seem more or less persuasive. Similarly, This house supports the narrative that people ought to be agnostic to the social background of the people they date. One kind of strange claim might be like this reduces intergenerational wealth inequality. Maybe this is sort of a high burden claim, but you might want to think about how you could actually convincingly prove that in a way that doesn't just sound assertive. Finally, I'll just touch a little bit about LO speeches and how they might differ, because I think most of this applies to PM speeches predominantly, but I think LO speeches are quite similar. The first thing that I would say is that LO speeches do not have to be a rebuttal speech because there is a deputy that whose job is just refuting their case. And so I think the primary job of an LO when you're starting out is you can sort of make your introduction and your characterization responsive to the version of the world that Gov has put out. And you want to strike the logical construction of their arguments, right? You want to create a worldview that functions such that even if their arguments are true, either through weighing or through some kind of rebuttal, your arguments are just more important. You'd want to integrate rebuttal into your argument construction because a lot of the times it's just like the gov team creates this argument and you say the inverse of the argument is true. And so you can just integrate sort of the rebuttal into the construction of the burdens by just saying things like, notice how this directly refutes or responds to what gov has already said, and this mechanism is more plausible than theirs because of X, Y, and Z. And finally, you want to make sure, and this is very important, that you are effectively the team that is setting the substructure of the debate. And a lot of the times I felt like on opening, I know that I'm clearly losing to the OG if I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle to access that substructure. And that happens a lot of the times because they just know more about the world, or because they get more ink on the flow, or because they're smarter with the way that they construct the characterization and the weighing and the worldview. So you want to make sure that you're not losing the framing battle outright before you even start constructing your arguments, because that's a surefire way of making your arguments just seem less plausible because they're already losing to what the other team has preempted. Um, Not going to do this. And so that's mainly what I have to say about constructing PM and LO speeches. For homework, which is optional, I think it is very, very helpful to watch some of these YouTube videos that I've cited about argument construction. I've learned a lot from them. And I think Ryan Lafferty has some lessons about argument construction and stock arguments and strategic argumentation that I think are really useful to read through and definitely informed my opinion on how to construct arguments too. Finally, if you have the time, I encourage you to just prep a few motions and, practice this prep structure that we talked about and how to construct a good case, and then deliver the PM and LO speeches. Figure out what worked and what didn't work, and then re-give those same speeches and see, whether or not refining your prep actually makes you a better speaker. I think that kind of exercise, recording yourself and listening to it, is incredibly effective. Great. Oh, I don't know why this is here, but that is all I have for today. Hopefully, this was somewhat marginally helpful. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I do think that being bad at giving first speeches has made me sort of pick up on what makes some first speeches relatively better or worse. Feel free to let me know if you have questions, concerns, comments, critiques, or anything else funny to share. Bye bye.